Hey guys, welcome to your second video. In this video, we're going to talk about matter and organic compounds. Some of this might be a little bit familiar in the fact that you guys probably talked about elements and compounds last year in Science 1. What's a little bit different is now we're going to relate those pieces into life and how that looks when we're talking about living organisms and the things that they do every single day. As a reminder, if you ever have any questions, please make sure to ask me at the end of these videos or during class, or you can email me. These are all good times to ask. It's always better to ask a question than not to ask at all because I always want to make sure that there is clarity. Sometimes I say things in these videos that may be confusing and then you'll be confused the entire time. So again, please make sure that you are asking questions anytime you have them. Again, this is an overview of the compounds and elements that make up an organism. So the first thing I want to talk about are chemical substances. And before we can even get started with that, we need to talk about matter. If you remember from last year or the year before or any time before that, matter is anything that has mass and takes up space. So everything around us it has matter. We have matter. Desks have matter, chairs have matter, and there are some types of matter that are considered living and other types of matter that are considered non-living. We are going to focus solely on living matter. And so before we can even get to the living matter portion, we need to talk about two ways that we can see matter broken up. The first being elements, the second being compounds. And why those are important is because elements are what make up everything in the world. So there are approximately 120 elements. Those are found on the periodic table. So if you look in the back of my classroom, you'll see that there is this nice, beautiful periodic table of the elements. All of those elements in some fashion contribute to the world that we see today. And when it comes to people and living organisms, there is a specific number of elements that make up humans. Those include carbon, oxygen. Those are the common ones we know, but other ones would be like phosphorus, chlorine, various types of elements like that. I want you to also understand that elements and compounds by themselves are not considered living. However, when they combine together and when we see them do reactions, that's when we can start talking about biomolecules, molecules for living organisms. So again, elements are made up of one type of atom and they are found on the periodic table. An example here that I have is helium. You'll also see the other example of oxygen. So those are elements. Now, in this specific example, the reason why oxygen is together with another oxygen is because in nature you don't find oxygen atoms by themselves. They do not exist. They exist always in a molecule format. The second type of matter is compounds, two or more elements chemically combined. And when I say chemically combined, I mean they are attached together, and if they become separated, they are now two brand new things. So please keep that in mind. A compound is chemically combined and you can't just physically separate it. Compounds are also called molecules. An example I provided here is water. What makes up water is 2 hydrogen atoms for every 1 oxygen atom. Again, chemically combined. Why are these important? We are going to further discuss what happens when these elements and compounds come together and what happens in life. More specifically, we're going to talk about the element carbon. Now, I talked about in the last slide, I said that elements and compounds are important to ensure life survives. Absolutely true. But we're going to focus, in this class, we're going to focus solely on carbon. Carbon is very, very special. If you remember anything from last year about valence electrons, if you don't remember, that's okay too. But the reason why carbon is so special is because it has the ability to make a lot of connections. It has the ability to make a lot of chemical reactions with a lot of different elements. And why that's important is because that means it's versatile. That means that it can combine with a bunch of other elements to make a whole lot of different molecules. Anytime you have different combinations of atoms, that's a different compound. That's a different molecule. So that's really what's so special about carbon. It has the ability to do that every single time. And then you'll notice here on this little slide that you see the ways we can see carbon. We see it when we talk about carbon dioxide, and that's a biomolecule, a molecule based off carbon. We see it when we talk about producing energy. Every single living organism requires carbon in some way. And this is why when organisms die, their body is like recycled, and it's this whole carbon cycle because of the fact that every living organism is based on biomolecules, which are based on carbon. They can be recycled and continuously flowed through. A product that is not carbon based is not what's considered biodegradable. So that means we can't break it down naturally. So those are things to keep in mind when we talk about this, that we're always going to be referencing bioorganisms, biomolecules, things that talk about living life. All right, so again, carbon is the main element found in organisms, and life would not exist without carbon. So again, carbon is super important. The reason why it's so important is because it makes 4 different types of compounds necessary for life. First one being carbohydrates, second being lipids, third being proteins, and fourth being nucleic acids. In the next slides, I'm going to talk about each one of those in a little bit more detail. I'm not going to get super crazy because, again, as we go through the year, we're going to talk about all these things, but I did feel like it was important to introduce you to a little bit of chemistry and just how it relates to biology. And I don't want you to think that like Science 1 is separate from biology and biology is separate from chemistry, because they really do all connect. Like I said, I want to talk about the biomolecules that make up life. The 4 types: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. And I said that out of order from this slide, but sorry, I'm referencing the notes that you're writing. So a couple of things. Carbohydrates, and you may have heard of the word, oh, I'm eating a lot of carbs today. What that indicates is that we're talking about sugars, we're talking about starches. So bread has a lot of carbs. Sugar has a lot of, candy has a lot of carbohydrates. These are foods that are high in those sugars and starches. And they're not always bad, but understand that our body gets a lot of energy from sugars and starches. So if your body gets a lot of sugar, it's going to take that energy and it's going to store it for later, because that's what your body does. If it has energy, we're not going to waste it, we're going to store it. And that's why we store fat, because we're eating a higher fat diet. So carbohydrates are sugars and starches. They provide energy to organisms. Carbs are a good thing in moderation. You can get carbs from any food out there. Any food out there. Every single food has sugars in it, even if it's not a sugary thing, or even if you don't relate it to that. And we'll again talk about that more. The other reason why carbs are super important is because they form structures. They're really, really nice at holding shapes. So for example, plants, the reason why they can stand up straight is because they're made of this outside structure called cellulose. And that's what keeps that really strong boundary. And that's why sometimes vegetables are harder to eat, because of that cellulose. Proteins. Proteins are made up of amino acids. The reason why proteins are super important is because they do everything inside of your body. Like everything that your body does is because of a certain type of protein. The next one being nucleic acids. This is your DNA and your RNA. Most of you probably know or you've heard of DNA, and this is your genetic material. RNA is very similar to that, but not identical. We'll talk about the differences in a few chapters, but I want you to understand that nucleic acids contain genetic instructions to make proteins. I just said proteins are the workers of the body. They do everything. So who has that information to make those proteins? Nucleic acids. So none of these biomolecules are more important than the other, but I do want you to recognize that there's maybe a little bit of a hierarchy system where we absolutely need DNA in order to do any of these other things. DNA has all of our genetic material, the genetic material you get from both your mom and your dad. And then finally, we have lipids. Lipids are fats and oils, and we typically think of fats and oils as not a good thing. But rest easy. Fats and oils are important because they are really good at storing energy, just like I talked about with carbohydrates. Carbohydrates most like provide energy. The lipids store the energy. And these are good because they help form a cell membrane. They help form protective barriers in your body that will ensure that things don't get into your cells that shouldn't be in the cells. Okay, this video may not be as long as the last one, and that's okay. If you have any questions, please make sure to ask me on Edpuzzle. We are going to start talking about this next week, and so make sure you have your notes written for class so we can go over it together and add what we need to add, take out or or highlight anything that we need to highlight. Again, ask me questions on Edpuzzle. Thanks.